To understand this story properly, I'm going to need to give you a brief introduction. I mean, nothing more really than a statement of some facts which Mr. Bachel obtained from the lady principal of the European College in Pune, India. Now, the story itself was obtained from Mr. Bachel with some difficulty. He was disposed to regard it as unsuitable for sharing because of its delicate nature. Now, when I assured him that I would relate it only to a select group of well-meaning and broad-minded individuals, his scruples were overcome. But please, ladies and gentlemen, deal discreetly with the knowledge that I'm about to impart. So, some facts. Lubrietta Rodria is described by her lady principal as an attractive and high-spirited girl of 17 belonging to the purple of Indian commerce. Drawing near as she was to a marriageable age and being courted by more than one eligible suitor, she was naturally an object of great interest to her schoolfellows, with whom her personal beauty and amiable temper had always made her a favourite. Now, she was not, the lady principal thought, a girl who would be regarded in Christian countries as of very high principle, but nonetheless she was one whom it was impossible not to like. Her career at the college had ended rather sensationally. She'd been immoderately anxious about her final examination, and its termination had found her in a state of physical and mental collapse. She had at once been removed to her father's house in the country, where she received such nursing and attention as her case required. But it was all to no avail. For 3 weeks she lay motionless, deprived of speech and refusing all food. And then, for a further period of 10 days, she lay in a plight still more distressing. She lost all consciousness, and despite the assurance of the doctors, her parents could hardly be persuaded that she lived. Her fiancé, who by this time had been declared, was in despair, not only from natural affection for Lubrietta, but also from remorse. You see, it was his intellectual ambition that had incited her to the eagerness in study, which was now threatening such dire results. And it was well understood that neither of the lovers would survive these anxious days of watching if they were not to be survived by both. After 10 days, however, a change supervened. Lubrietta came back to life amid the frenzied rejoicing of the household and all her circle. She recovered her health and her strength at incredible speed, and within 3 months she was married, as the lady principal had cause to believe, with the happiest prospects. So much by way of background. Now, Mr. Bachel had not, whilst residing at Standground, lost entirely touch with the university which had given him his degree, and in which he had formerly held 1 or 2 minor offices. He'd earned no great distinction as a scholar, but he had taken a degree in honours, and he was possessed of a useful amount of general knowledge. And in this he found not only constant pleasure, but also occasional profit. You see, the university had made herself, for better or worse, an examiner of 100 times as many students as she could possibly teach. Her system of examinations had extended to the very limits of the British Empire, and her certificates of proficiency were coveted in every quarter of the globe. And in the examination of these students, Mr. Bachel, who had considerable experience in teaching, was annually employed. Papers from all over the world were to be found littered about his study, and the examination of these papers called for several weeks of strenuous labour at the end of every year. As the weeks passed, he would anxiously watch the growth of a neat stack of papers in the corner of the room, which indicated the number to which marks had been assigned and reported. Now, the day upon which the last of these was laid in place was a day of satisfaction, second only to that which later on brought him a substantial cheque to compensate him for his labours. Now, during this period of special effort, I'm sorry to say, Mr. Bachel's servants had their share of discomforts. The chairs and tables, which they were ordinarily expected to dust and to arrange, were loaded with papers which they were forbidden to touch. And although they were warned against showing visitors into any room where these papers might be lying, Mr. Bachel would inconsiderately leave them lying in every room that he had. The privacy of his study, however, where the work was chiefly done, was strictly guarded, and no one was admitted there unless by Mr. Bachel himself. Well, you can imagine his annoyance then when he returned from an evening engagement at the beginning of January and found a stranger seated in his study. His annoyance, however, was not long in subsiding, because the visitor was a lady, and as she sat by the lamp, a single glance was enough to show that she was young and extremely beautiful. Now, the interest that this young lady excited in Mr. Bachel was altogether unusual. I mean, his first conjecture was that she had called to give him notice of a marriage, but gosh, he was really charmed by her presence, and he was quite content to find her in no haste to state her errand. Her manner, in fact, was most singular, because by neither word nor movement did she show that she was even conscious of Mr. Bachel's having entered the room. He began at length with his customary formula. "What can I have the pleasure of doing for you?" And when, at the sound of his voice, she turned her fine dark eyes upon him, he saw that they were wet with tears. Oh, well, Mr. Bachel was now really moved. As a tear fell upon the lady's cheek, she raised her hand as if to conceal it, and a brilliant sapphire sparkled in the lamplight as she did so. And then the lady's distress and the exquisite grace of her presence altogether overcame him. There stole upon Mr. Bachel a strange feeling of tenderness, which he supposed to be paternal, but he knew nevertheless to be indiscreet. Now, he was a prudent man with strict notions of propriety, and so, ostensibly with a view to giving the lady a few minutes in which to recover her composure, he quietly left the study and went into another room to pull himself together. Now, Mr. Bachel, like most solitary men, had a habit of talking to himself. "It's no good, R.B.," he said, "to pretend that you've retired on this damsel's account. If you don't care now, you're going to make a fool of yourself." He took up from the table a volume of the Encyclopedia, in which the day before he'd been looking up Pestalozzi, and he turned over the pages in search of something to restore his equanimity. An article on perspective proved to be the very thing. Wholly unromantic in character, its copious presentment of hard fact relieved his mind, and he was soon threading his way along paths of knowledge to which he was little accustomed. He applied his remedy with such persistence that when 4 or 5 minutes had passed, he felt sufficiently composed to return to the study. He framed as he went a suitable form of words with which to open the conversation, and he took with him his register of banns of marriage, of which he thought he foresaw the need. As he opened the study door, however, the book fell to the ground, so overcome was he by surprise, because he found that the room was empty. The lady had disappeared. The chair stood vacant before him. Well, Mr. Bachel sat down for a moment and rang the bell. It was answered shortly by the boy who always attended upon him. "When did the lady go?" asked Mr. Bachel. The boy looked bewildered. "So the lady that you showed into my study before I came." "But please, sir, I never show anyone into the study. I never do when you're out." No, there was a lady here when I returned. The boy now looked incredulous. Did, did you not let somebody out just now? No, sir, said the boy. I put the chain on the front door as soon as you came in. Well, this was conclusive. I mean, the chain upon the hall door was an ancient and cumbrous thing and could not be manipulated without considerable effort and a great deal of noise. Mr. Bachel released the boy and began to think furiously. Now, he was not, as you know, without some experience of the supranormal side of nature, and he knew, of course, that the visit of this enthralling lady had a purpose, but he was beginning also to know that it had had an effect. He sat before his fire, reproducing her image, and soon he gave that up in disgust because his imagination refused to do her justice. I mean, he could recover the details of her appearance, but he could combine them into nothing that would reproduce the impression that she had made upon him. I mean, he was unable to concentrate on the examination papers lying on his table. His mind wandered too often to the other topic, that he felt himself to be in danger of marking the answers unfairly. So he turned away from his work and he moved to another chair where he sat down to read. It was the chair in which she herself had sat, and he made no attempt to pretend that he'd chosen it on any other account. Oh, he'd made some discoveries about himself during the last half hour, and he gave himself now another surprise when he came to select his book. I mean, in the ordinary course of what he'd supposed to be his nature, he would certainly have returned to the article on perspective. I mean, it was lying open in the next room, and he'd read no more than a 10th part of it. But instead of that, his thoughts went back to a volume that he'd but once opened, and that for no more than 2 minutes. He'd received a book by way of a birthday present early in the preceding year from a relative who had bestowed either no consideration at all or else a great deal of cunning upon its selection. It was a collection of 17th century lyrics, which Mr. Bachel's single glance had sufficed to condemn. I mean, regarding the one lyric he had read as a sort of literary freak, he'd banished the book to one of the spare bedrooms and had never seen it since. But now, after this long interval, the absurd lines which his eye had but once lighted upon recurred to his mind. Fair, sweet, and young, receive a prize reserved for your victorious eyes. And so far from thinking them absurd as he recalled them now, Mr. Bachel went upstairs to fetch the book, in which he was soon absorbed. These lyrics no longer seemed unreasonable to him. Now, he felt conscious as he read one after another of a side of nature that he'd strangely neglected. And he was obliged to admit that the men whose feelings were set forth in the various sonnets and poems had indeed a fine gift of expression. Thus, whilst I look for her in vain, methinks I am a child again, and of my shadow am a chasing. For all her graces are to me like apparitions that I see, but never can come near the embracing. Oh, no, no, no. No, these men were not, as he had formerly supposed, writing with air, and he felt ashamed at having used the term freak at their expense. Mr. Bachel read more of the lyrics, some of them twice, and one of them much oftener. That one he began to commit to memory, and since the household had retired to rest, to recite aloud. He'd been unaware that literature contained anything so beautiful. And as he looked again at the book, a tear fell upon the page. Now, this was a thing so extraordinary that Mr. Bachel first looked up at the ceiling, But when he found that it was indeed a tear from his own eye, he was immoderately pleased with himself. Had she not shed a tear as she sat upon this very chair? The fact seemed to draw them together. Contemplation of this sort was, however, a luxury to be enjoyed in something like moderation. Mr. Bachel soon set down his lyrics and savagely began to add up columns of marks by way of discipline. And when he had totalled several pages of these, respect for his normal self had returned with sufficient force to take him to bed. Now, the matter of his dreams, or whether he dreamed at all, has not been disclosed, but he awoke at any rate in a calmer state of mind, and such romantic thoughts as remained were effectually dispelled by the sight of his own face when he began to shave. God, fancy you spouting lyrics, he said, as he dabbed the brush around his mouth. And by the time he was ready for breakfast, he pronounced himself cured. Now, among the letters lying upon the breakfast table that morning was one from the university official who controlled the system of examination. Now, the form of the envelope was too familiar to leave Mr. Bachel in any doubt as to what it contained. It was a letter which, to a careful man like him, seemed to have the nature of a reproof, inasmuch as it probably asked for information which it had already been his duty to furnish. Yeah, well, the contents of the envelope, when he torn it open, answered this expectation. He was formally requested to supply the name and the marks of candidate 1004, and he wondered as he ate his breakfast how he admitted to return them already. He hunted out the paper of number 1004 as soon as the meal was over. The candidate proved to be one Lubrietta, of whom, of course, he had never heard, and her answers had all been marked. He couldn't understand why they should have been made the subject of inquiry. He took the papers in his hand and he looked at them again as he stood with his back to the fire, smoking his pipe. And then he discovered something that was much harder to understand. The marks were not his own. In place of the usual sketchy numerals, hardly decipherable to anyone but himself, he saw figures which were carefully formed. And the marks assigned to his first answer, as he saw it on the uppermost sheet, were higher than the maximum number obtainable for that question. Mr. Bachel laid down his pipe and seated himself at the table. He was greatly puzzled now. As he turned over the sheets of number 1004, he found all the other questions marked in the like manner, and making a total of half as much again as the highest possible number. Who the dickens has been playing with my papers? He muttered to himself. The need of the moment, however, was to furnish the proper marks to the official at Cambridge, and Mr. Bachel therefore proceeded to read paper number 1004 right through. And he soon found that he had read it before. It proved, in fact, to be a paper over which he'd spent some time, and for a singularly interesting reason. He'd learned from a friend in the Indian civil service that an exaggerated value was often placed by ambitious Indians upon a European education, and that many aspiring young men declined to take a wife who had not passed this very examination. It was to Mr. Bachel a rather disquieting reflection that his blue pencil was not only marking mistakes, but might at the same time be cancelling matrimonial engagements. And his friend's communication had made him scrupulously careful in examining the work of young ladies in Oriental schools. The matter had occurred to him as he'd examined the answers of Lubrietta Rodria. He perfectly remembered the question upon which his success depended. It was a problem in logic that had been answered by a rambling and worthless argument, but which had somehow hit upon the right conclusion. I mean, the conclusion might be a happy guess, or it might have been secured by less honest means. Either way, Mr. Bachel at the time had followed his usual practice and given it no marks. It wasn't here, however, that he found his cause for hesitation, but rather when he'd come to the end of the paper and found that the candidate had only just failed, he turned back to the critical question and began to imagine an eligible bachelor awaiting the result of the examination. And then, after a period of vacillation, he'd hastily put the symbol of failure upon the paper, lest he should be tempted to bring his own charity to the rescue of the candidate's logic and unfairly add the 3 marks which would suffice to pass her. But as he now read through these answers, for a second time, the same pitiful thought troubled him. And this time, more than before, because over the edge of the paper of number 1004, there persistently arose the image of the young lady with the sapphire ring. It directed the current of his thoughts. I mean, suppose if Lubrietta Rodria were anything like her. And I mean, what if the arguments of number 1004 were worthless? I mean, young ladies were notoriously weak in argument and strong in conclusions, and after all, the conclusion was correct. Well, I mean, ought not a correct conclusion have its marks? I mean, they followed much to the same purpose, and in the end, Mr. Bachel stultified himself by adding the necessary 3 marks and therefore passing the candidate. Now, he enclosed in the envelope returning the paper a request to know why the marks had been asked for in the first place, since they had certainly been returned in their proper place. And a brief reply informed him the next day that the marks he had returned exceeded the maximum and must therefore have been wrongly entered. Now, curious as all that was, it was less curious than what immediately followed. You see, it was Mr. Bachel's practice to avoid any delay in returning these official papers, and so he had gone out there and then to post his envelope. The post office is no more than 100 yards from his front door, and in 3 minutes he was back in his study again. The first object that met his eye was a beautiful sapphire ring lying on his desk. Oh, Mr. Bachel at once recognized it. He took it up and examined it. It looked to be of considerable value. Stone was large and brilliant, and the setting was of extremely fine workmanship. What am I to do with this? Said Mr. Bachel. Now, the nearest jeweller to Stoneground was a competent and experienced tradesman of the old school. He was a member of the local Natural History Society, and in that capacity, Mr. Bachel had made some intimate acquaintance with him. To this jeweller, therefore, he carried the ring and asked him what he thought of it. I'll give you £40 for that, said the jeweller. Well, Mr. Bachel replied that the ring was not his. But what about the make of it, he said. Is it English? The jeweller replied that it was unmistakably Indian. Are you sure about that? Said Bachel. Certain, said the jeweller. Yeah, Major Ackroyd bought one in like it, all but the stone, from Poona. I repaired it for him last year. Well, that information was enough for Mr. Bachel. He begged a suitable box from his friend, the jeweller, and within an hour he had posted the ring to Miss Lubrietta Rodria, care of the European College in Poona. And at the same time, he wrote to the principal of that college the letter whose answer I summarized at the beginning. Having done this, Mr. Bachel felt more at ease. I mean, he had given Lubrietta Rodria what he amiably called the benefit of the doubt, but it should never be said that he'd been bribed. The rest of the papers he marked with a fierce justice. A great deal of the work in his zeal he did twice over, in fact, but his conscience amply requited him for the superfluous labour. The last paper was marked within a day of the allotted time, and Mr. Bachel shortly afterwards received his cheque, glad to think that the whole matter was now at an end. Now, that Lubrietta had been absent from India whilst her relatives and attendants were trying to restore her to consciousness, well, Mr. Bachel had good reason to know. His friends, however, for the most part, took a narrower view of human nature and its possibilities, and so he kept his experience for a long time to himself. There were personal reasons, he felt, for not discussing the incident. There does remain, however, a further episode which Mr. Bachel all but managed to suppress upon the one occasion when he allowed himself to speak of this matter to me and two other friends. You see, I had pressed him for a description of the sapphire ring, and he wasn't very successful in his attempt to describe it. I mean, there was no reason, of course, why this should lay his good faith under suspicion. Again, few of us could pass an examination upon objects with which we're supposed to be familiar, or say which of our tables has 3 legs and which 4. One of Mr. Bachel's auditors, however, took a captious view of the matter and remarked brusquely, in imitation of a more famous skeptic, "I don't believe there's no such a thing." Mr. Bachel, of course, recognised the quotation, and it was his eagerness to establish his credit that committed him at that point to a last disclosure about Lubrietta. He drew a sapphire ring from his pocket, handed it to the incredulous auditor, and addressed him in the manner of Mrs. Gamp. "What, you beige creature? Have I had this ring 3 or 4 more years to be told there ain't no such a thing? Get along with you." "But I thought that the ring was sent back," I said. How did you come by it?" And Mr. Bachel thereupon admitted that he had closed his story prematurely. About 6 weeks after the return of the ring to Poona, he'd found it again on his table, returned through the post. Enclosed in the package was a note, which Mr. Bachel, being now committed to this part of the story, also passed round for inspection. The note ran as follows: "Accept the ring, dear one, and wear it for my sake. Fail not to think sometimes of her whom you have made happy. L.R." What on earth am I to do with this? Mr. Bachel had asked himself again. And this time he had answered the question, after the briefest possible delay, by slipping the ring upon his 4th finger. The book of lyrics remains downstairs. It's amongst his most consulted books. Mr. Bachel can repeat at least half of the collection now from memory. I mean, of course, he knows well enough that such terms as dear one are addressed to bald gentlemen only in a Pickwickian sense. But even with that sense, the letter still gives him pleasure. He admits that he thinks very often of her whom he's made happy. But he admits also that he cannot exclude from his thoughts at those times an ungenerous regret, which is that he's also made happy a nameless Indian gentleman, whom he, with a peculiar tone in his voice, always refers to as that other fellow.